Hey, what's up? Charlie and Kyle here. We just finished up a Saturday morning at Drive. Beautiful weather out. I think we're all starting to see more people live, yeah?
Yeah.
So we still seeing a lot of people virtual, which is just, I don't know, for me it's been fun because it is forced certain types of things to really dial in exercise, demonstrate exercise.
Communication, language, yeah.
I think for us too is a different type of person.
Yeah.
These are people that maybe don't know exactly what they're looking for, and their main thing was this level of convenience.
Right.
And the reality is, for people that we see in person, convenience isn't high on their list.
Right.
For a number of reasons. And then that becomes a different experience where that person is usually more familiar with what we do. They certainly have much higher expectations. A lot of times we work more as a consultant. We don't see them very often, but with these virtual, we're seeing them a lot more often.
Yeah, consistently.
So it's interesting. Yeah. But definitely seeing a lot more people live. Obviously, I'm now in 3 times a week, and gym is clean. We're handling things at a very high level of health consciousness.
Sure.
I've gotten into the habit of saying to people, if at any point something doesn't seem right to them, then we call it off.
Yep.
and we move on. And I don't think we've really had that happen. So cool.
It's all been great.
And you got some good news this week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Kyle messaged me. He says, "What do you think about blah blah blah?" And I'm not quite sure I understood what it was.
Yeah.
But so let's talk about that.
So I'm a physical therapist, but I also fancy myself a fantasy football junkie, and it seems I'll get to marry the two now, as I'll be the doctor of physical therapy, official medical consultant of the Dynasty Warzone podcast with Memphis and Jared.
Memphis. His name is Memphis.
It's one of his names that he goes
Will
by.
he be watching this?
I'll make him.
Okay. So
now he has to.
I have been to Memphis several times, but that's cool. So what will you be doing? You're gonna try to interpret some of these messages.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the ones that this was sort of born out of was Darius Geis is coming off a number of knee surgeries, and everybody got hyped up to see him box squatting 585. Maybe quarter half squat with very little shin angle, as we would say. And, some people would say that that's a good thing that he's avoiding stressing his knees. And I would beg to differ.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And so.
So what are you thinking there? So, because obviously, I talked about this 10, 12 years ago. And as someone that was always a wide stance squatter, which kind of forces you to hinge that way, I do think the literature is fact that it loads the knee less.
Correct.
Than it loads the hip and lower back. But that might be your problem, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you're arching at the wrong time in that lift.
Right.
Yeah, no question.
Sure.
So the reality is a vertical tibia, at any level of anecdotal support, most knees feel better in a vertical tibia.
Sure.
And if you don't have ankle mobility,
Sure.
then you have a way to load the lower body.
Right.
But you're trading the knee probably for the lower back.
For sure.
So when you go real big, you better make sure your technique is dialed in.
Right.
Would you agree that that's what you were talking about?
Yeah.
So now, are you going to you're going to try to get a media credential so you can start to learn about some of these things before they happen?
That's not a bad thought.
When you work in professional sport, you're always somewhat tempted to share these things, but I don't know if that's always the right thing to do, because if you ever get caught, you won't be working in professional sports much longer.
No.
But hey, these reporters got to learn it from someplace. So it's not like some of the Stefania Bell is not hanging around in the locker room, in the training room, getting all this information. Someone's telling her.
Mm-hmm.
So that's we'll see if you go down that road with Memphis and your fantasy football stuff. The one league that I'm still in, I think we've been doing it for like 25 years. It's really amazing, it's largely the same. So out of 12, there's probably like 6 or 7 of us, at least 6 or 7, that have done it every year.
High school?
So out of the original group, and I think it's gone from like 12 to 14 a couple years.
Okay.
The 3 of us were from high school.
Gotcha.
Or even before that. Chris, who I known probably since the age of 6 or 7, he moved on. But then me and Justin, there were the 2 from everybody else is from Boston, and so that's. I've had
a couple championships in there. Hopefully.
I believe I have 2, which is not a lot for 25 years. but I've had more total points, and then you just lose.
Yeah.
You never really lose at fantasy football. The other person wins.
Right.
Where my team is just so stacked, and somehow I just lose at a certain point. And then other years have been very questionable in my selection, because a lot of times recently the draft would be during international basketball. So I can't, I'm in freaking China or Australia or something like last year, and I have to do auto draft.
Right.
But auto draft, I won with auto draft. So maybe that tells you my drafting ability. So I need to listen to your podcast.
Yeah.
So the last time we filmed, we talked really about lateralizations and regressions, but we used this tissue extensibility dysfunction, culling out neural versus myofascial.
Correct.
So when we talk about the tissue extensibility dysfunction, people might argue, and I'm not sure there's ever a real way to say that you're mobilizing a hamstring muscle versus the fascia, whether either are even possible. But what we do know that nerves don't seem to like as much time under tension. Where if the nerve is tensioned or not flossing through certain areas, holding it there doesn't seem to work.
Right.
And maybe give a little review of what you did with your young lady where you skip steps. We'll
talk about the skip steps.
Yeah, you got it done. You got it done. So you wanted to deadlift?
Yes,
yeah, go ahead.
We wanted to deadlift. The deadlift was painful. Then we looked at toe touch, and then went down a couple of the breakouts of the toe touch. Skipping a few steps along the way that we'll talk about, but ultimately getting to, as we say, like the sniff test, it really started to smell like something neural. And we went to some nerve glides, slides, flossing, whatever you'd like to call it, and then retested the toe touch, and it was fine, and got right back to deadlifting.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting message, and probably not one that should be duplicated, because everyone's experience and their sniff test is a little bit different. But I think the lesson is more concept that stretching a hamstring is different than stretching a nerve,
right.
But also concepts of that you can get after things very, very quickly if you have a system, and when you have a system, you'll be able to see things a little bit quicker.
Right.
When you can blink, as Gladwell would talk about. So what I wanted to demonstrate, which we alluded to a little bit last week, we're not going to at all discuss someone that has pain that we think is from a neural we're not going to get into that at all. However, there's lots of people that can't touch their toes that don't have pain. There's lots of people that have very limited posterior chain mobility but have no pain. So what do? Well, a lot of times we think it's going to be one thing when we can really run the same evaluation model. And if we know our anatomy and we know what tissues are being biased when we make changes to the movement, then we should be able to apply similar concepts.
Right.
Because if someone can't touch their toes, you don't know if it's from their lumbar or their thoracic. You don't know if it's from the hip joint. You don't know if it's from the posterior chain. But where we're going to talk about is if it's from the posterior chain, is it the myofascial components, and of what? And is it or is it the neural component, which would largely be the sciatic nerve that we know travels all the way up from the sacral plexus through the hip, through the knee, and then branches below the knee, but then all the way into the foot.
Right.
So let's, I'll stand behind. Kyle, why don't you just lay down on your back, okay? Cool? Yep. All right. So if at any point someone has pain, we're just calling it off. Like this is, and it's not because I don't think people can understand the concepts. It's that techniques can be unreliable in the presence of pain. So if anybody gets any bright idea that what I am showing you is for someone that has pain down the back of their leg or pain in their back, like what Kyle talked about, that's not what we're doing. We're talking about people that have tension and we think is from the posterior chain, but there's no pain. No pain, okay? So we're gonna just go to a passive position here. Active would work just the same, but passive will make a little bit more sense to demonstrate, all right? So I'm gonna lock up the knee into extension and maybe I'll stay below the knee so I don't put any compression here, and we're gonna dorsiflex. So I'll switch my hands for the purpose of the camera, and now Kyle's R1, his first area of resistance is right about here. Would you agree?
Yep.
So there's no, magician, etc. I could probably get him a little bit more, and you see his reaction. It's not so hot. Okay. So right now there might be a reason to think that we should mobilize his hamstrings. Okay. What else do we have? Could it be the glutes? Sure. Could it be the calf? Remember, I'm really cranking on dorsiflexion. It could be. But it could also be the nerve, because even though we're not tensioning the nerve north of that sacral plexus, everything from the toes to the ankle, to the different knee joints is here, all right? So now the hamstring, we know our tendons are blending into the capsule on the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus comes around to the pes anserine, and the biceps femoris comes over here to the fibula. So the length is right here. We're not going to change that at all, but we're going to judge this full movement. So the first thing that we're going to do is find R1, okay? Remember, hamstring is from here to here. We're not going to do anything to it in terms of its tension, because now if I let Kyle planar flex, I did nothing to change the hamstring. It is in the exact same place. And now I don't find Kyle terribly limited, but let's say he wanted more. And now that R1 is up here. So I don't think the difference between those two resistance is because of the hamstring. Now I can't prove with that technique whether it was the sciatic nerve, which is probably what it's going to be, or was it because the gastroc that does cross, the medial and lateral gastroc does cross. So you have a choice at that point. You can go to your tensioner that you showed us in the previous video and just see if this changes. I think it would. However, you could also mobilize the calf if you wanted to, and then see if it changed. Now, something else you can try here, so now I'm in this same position, and now I'm back to that R1, all right? I can maintain dorsiflexion, but I can now slack some of our two joint muscles that are at the toes. And now I can't really rig this the way I want, but I'm going to maintain dorsiflexion, and our R1 is not there's not as much of a gap, right, but it still moved more. Right. Yep. Okay? So if I slack out some of those branches that come off the sciatic nerve, I could probably make the assertion that it's not the gastroc. Right. And I'm just looking to save time so I can get into some of those higher level drills like what you wanted to do with the deadlift. So again, if I look at it real quick, dorsiflexion with toes, R1, planar flex, R1, without a whole lot of action on this side, right? Okay, then we could probably look to the nerve. So why don't you show them, and then we'll just retest, because that's kind of how we've got our comparable sign. Okay. So this is a tensioner, and without a, so I'm sorry, Kyle's not doing a tensioner. No, do the one that you think is right.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's a slider. Yeah, so he's slacking north when he extends the neck, and he tensions everything south. Good. Let's give it a ride. So what was that? 5-6 repetitions?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. So again, you'll have to call BS if anybody thinks that we're like playing games on this. And then that R1 is clearly improved.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
You know, you can look at this. You know, if we get up there and we see what happens here, that's more pelvis. But we didn't see a lot of movement there. And certainly, if he did 3 sets of 8, we'd probably see a significant change.
Sure.
All right. So I know, hopefully that fills in some of the gaps that what we talked about on our previous video. But remember, this I would highly recommend, insist that this approach should only be used for people that are suspected to have posterior chain tension, and you'd like to learn what is the best technique. Because remember, any technique can always work. Are we looking to mobilize the myofascial component, or are you looking to mobilize the nerve? Because they have two completely different stimulus. And a stiff nerve that's not painful, you start cranking on it, it might bark a little bit, and now you're kind of getting out of your league. So I hope this makes sense. Kyle, you got anything to add?
No, that's great.
All right. So that's change positions, eliminate joints, active versus passive. That's always going to be the hallmarks to the key movement evaluation. And here we just showed you how to tell the difference between a myofascial component or a neural component to a posterior chain mobility dysfunction.